In the history of the National Football League, there are players who played the game, and then there was the man who conquered it. He didn't dance, he didn't celebrate, he didn't ask for permission. Jim Brown didn't just run with a football, he assaulted the earth with every stride. To the fans who grew up watching the NFL evolve, Jim Brown wasn't just a memory. He was the ghost that haunted every running back who came after him. When Walter Payton fought for every inch, he was chasing Brown. When Barry Sanders made defenders vanish, he was measured against Brown. When Emmitt Smith endured the grind, he was walking the path Brown paved. For 9 seasons, between 1957 and 1965, Jim Brown was indestructible. He never missed a game. He never missed a practice. He treated tackling like a personal insult and the end zone like his birthright. He left the game on his own terms, shocking the world while he was still the MVP, leaving a standard that has stood like a monument of granite for over half a century. But even a titan has peers. Even a man made of steel felt the bruises. At 87 years old, shortly before he left this world in 2023, the legendary number 32 looked back. He didn't talk about the touchdowns or the movie deals. He talked about the war. He talked about the men across the line of scrimmage who forced him to summon every ounce of his will. These aren't just names in a history book. These are the gladiators of the golden age, the men who defined toughness when face masks were single bars and the grass was real mud. These are the players who earned the ultimate sign of respect, the admiration of Jim Brown. Today, we journey back to the frozen fields of Cleveland, the mud of Green Bay, and the battlegrounds of Yankee Stadium. We're going to hear the 5 names that Jim Brown called the toughest he ever faced, and the one coach who tried to tame the untamable. This is the story of iron sharpening iron. Jim Brown averaged 5.2 yards per carry, a record that still defies logic for a fullback. But by the summer of 1966, while on the set of the movie The Dirty Dozen, Brown made the call. He retired. He walked away at age 30, fresh off an MVP season. He left before the game could decline him. For the next 50 years, until his passing at age 87, he sat as the godfather of the NFL. He watched Earl Campbell, Eric Dickerson, and Adrian Peterson. He respected them all. But when asked who truly tested his manhood, who made him dig into the reserves of his soul, he looked back to his own era. Here are the 5 men Jim Brown named as his toughest opponents. Number 5, the Secretary of Defense, David Deacon Jones. Jim Brown did not fear men, but he respected chaos, and nobody created chaos quite like the defensive end for the Los Angeles Rams. In the 1960s, the term sack didn't exist in the record books until Deacon Jones invented the word because, as he put it, sacking a city involves devastation. Brown faced the Rams and their fearsome, foursome defensive line multiple times. What made Jones unique, according to Brown, was a combination of speed and a move that was eventually banned because it was too dangerous: the head slap. Deacon Jones didn't just block shed. He would deliver a concussive slap to the offensive tackle's helmet, ringing their ears, and then use his sprinter's speed to chase down the ball carrier. Jim Brown, usually the fastest man on the field, admitted that Jones was one of the few defenders who could run him down from the backside. Deacon was different, Brown once said in a retrospective interview. He was mean, not dirty, but mean. He wanted to embarrass you. For Brown, the challenge of facing Jones was tactical. He knew he couldn't just bounce outside because Deacon was too fast. He had to run directly at him, using his own power to negate Jones's speed. It was a collision of 2 irresistible forces. In the 1980s and 90s, we saw pass rushers like Lawrence Taylor and Reggie White dominate the game. But Jim Brown always reminded people that the blueprint came from Deacon Jones. Jones was the prototype of the modern athletic disruptor. When Brown spoke of Jones in his later years, he spoke with a chuckle, the kind of laugh that comes from surviving a near-death experience. He remembered the sound of Jones's footsteps. To Jim Brown, Deacon Jones represented the pure, unadulterated aggression of the NFL. He was a player who would have been a star in any decade. But in the 60s, he was a nightmare. Number 4, Gino Marchetti. To Jim Brown, he was the gold standard of technique. Gino Marchetti of the Baltimore Colts. While Deacon Jones was chaos, Gino Marchetti was precision. A staple of the great Colts teams of the late 50s, led by Johnny Unitas, Marchetti was a defensive end who played the run better than anyone in history. Jim Brown called Marchetti the perfect football player. Why? Because you couldn't trick him. Brown was famous for his cutback ability. He would press the line, wait for a defender to over-pursue, and then cut against the grain for a touchdown. But Marchetti never took the bait. "He was the best defensive end I ever played against," Brown said. "He played the run as well as the pass. You couldn't run inside of him, and you couldn't run outside of him. He forced you to stop your feet." Marchetti was the anchor of the Colts' defense during the famous 1958 NFL Championship, the greatest game ever played. Although Brown's Browns weren't in that specific game, their battles with the Colts were legendary. In 1958 and 1959, the Colts were the kings of the NFL, and Brown took it personally that his team was second fiddle. Brown respected Marchetti's discipline. In an era where guys played with reckless abandon, Marchetti was a technician. He used leverage. He used his hands. For a runner like Brown, who relied on vision and anticipating mistakes, Marchetti was a puzzle that was nearly impossible to solve. Number 3. Dick Butkus. Monster of the Midway. Dick Butkus. This selection is special because their time on the field together was fleeting, yet the impact was seismic. Dick Butkus was a rookie in 1965. Jim Brown was in his final season. It was the passing of the torch from one era of violence to the next. They only faced each other twice, but that was enough. Brown described Butkus as an animal, and he meant it as the highest compliment. By 1965, Jim Brown had seen it all. He had figured out every linebacker in the league. But then came this rookie from Illinois, wearing number 51 for the Chicago Bears, who played with a rage that seemed personal. In their first meeting, Butkus was eager to make a name for himself by taking down the king. Brown remembered the collisions. "He was a maniac," Brown recalled at age 87. "He wanted to tear your head off, and he had the size to do it." Butkus was the flame. He stripped the ball. He tackled runners by the neck. He played through injury. There is a famous story, often retold by NFL historians, of a play in 1965 where Brown broke through the line and saw the rookie Butkus waiting. Instead of cutting, Brown lowered his shoulder. The collision sounded like a car crash. Brown fell forward for the extra 2 yards, as he always did. But he admitted later that Butkus was the only man who hit him hard enough to make him check if his teeth were still there. Jim Brown respected Butkus because Butkus represented the pure ID of football. No strategy, just destruction. Brown knew that if he had stayed in the league past 1965, his primary nemesis would have been Dick Butkus. By listing him here, Brown acknowledges the greatness that was rising just as he was walking away. Number 2. Sam Huff, the rival. Sam Huff. If you were a football fan in the late 1950s and early 60s, there was only one matchup that mattered: Jim Brown versus Sam Huff. It was the irresistible force meeting the immovable object. Sam Huff was the middle linebacker for the New York Giants. The Giants of that era were the glamour team of the NFL, playing in Yankee Stadium, the media capital of the world. And the Giants' defensive coordinator, Tom Landry, years before he became the Cowboys legend, designed a defense specifically to stop one man: Jim Brown. It was called the 4-3 inside. The strategy was simple but brutal. Ignore everyone else and gang tackle number 32. And Sam Huff was the designated hitter. "Sam Huff was the guy who challenged me the most mentally," Brown said. "Every play he was shouting. Every play he was keying on me. It was a chess match played with sledgehammers. The rivalry was intense." In 1958, the Giants and Browns played a playoff game to decide who would go to the championship. The Giants shut down the Browns, holding Brown to just 8 yards on 7 carries in a snow-choked Yankee Stadium. It was the lowest point of Brown's career. But Brown responded. In the years that followed, he destroyed the Giants. In a game in 1963, he rushed for 175 yards against Huff's defense. Brown respected Huff because Huff made it personal. It wasn't just business. Huff wanted to be the man who stopped the greatest runner alive. They had a relationship built on combat. After plays, they would glare at each other, mud-spattered, breathing steam into the cold air. Sam Huff brought a swagger to the linebacker position. Jim Brown knew that without Sam Huff, his own legend wouldn't be as great. You need a great villain to make a hero, and for Jim Brown, Sam Huff was the ultimate adversary. Number 1. Doug Atkins, and finally the number 1 toughest player Jim Brown ever faced. A name that surprises many, but not those who played in the trenches in the 1950s and 60s. Doug Atkins. Atkins played defensive end for the Cleveland Browns before Brown arrived, the Chicago Bears, and the New Orleans Saints. He stood 6'8" and weighed 260 pounds, a giant in an era of normal-sized men. He was a freak of nature who could high jump over offensive linemen. Jim Brown didn't hesitate when naming him. Doug Atkins was a mountain, Brown said. He was so strong, he could throw a blocker into you. He was the only man I ever saw who could control the entire side of a line of scrimmage by himself. Brown recalled that running to Atkins's side was suicide. Atkins didn't just rush the passer, he would stand up tackles, shed them like rag dolls, and swallow running backs whole. I didn't like running at Doug, Brown admitted, a rare admission of avoidance from the toughest man in football. He was just too big and too strong. Atkins was a unique character, known for his rebellious streak, much like Brown. But on the field, his physical dominance was unmatched. While Brown could outrun Huff and outsmart Marchetti, he simply couldn't overpower Atkins. By placing Doug Atkins at number 1, Jim Brown reminds us that football is, at its core, a game of physics. And in the glorious, violent history of the NFL, Doug Atkins was a physical anomaly that even the great Jim Brown approached with extreme caution. The coach, Paul Brown. Every great player is shaped by a teacher. For Jim Brown, it was the man who gave the team his name, Paul Brown. This relationship was not one of warmth. It was not a father-son dynamic. It was complicated, fraught with tension, and absolutely essential to history. Paul Brown was a genius. He invented the modern face mask, the practice squad, and the draw play. He was a disciplinarian who believed in total control. He called every play from the sideline, something that infuriated Jim Brown, who wanted the freedom to read the defense himself. He treated us like robots, Jim Brown once criticized. But later in life, at age 87, the resentment had faded into a begrudging respect. Jim Brown acknowledged that without Paul Brown drafting him in 1957, his life would have been different. Paul Brown built the system. He built the offensive line that opened the holes. He created the discipline that allowed the Browns to dominate. He was the greatest teacher of football, Jim Brown conceded. We didn't get along personally. We saw the world differently, but he taught me preparation. The friction between them is legendary. It is part of why Jim Brown retired early, but that friction created a fire. Jim Brown ran angry, partially to prove his coach wrong, partially to prove he was bigger than the system. In the end, the combination of Paul Brown's mind and Jim Brown's body created the most dominant run game the world has ever seen. Jim Brown passed away in May of 2023. He left behind a legacy that cannot be replicated. In an era of specialization, he was everything. He named Jones, Marchetti, Butkus, Huff, and Atkins not to glorify them, but to validate his own journey. A warrior is defined by his enemies. By honoring the toughness of these 5 men, Jim Brown was telling us one last time, I walked among giants, and I did not fall. Consider the magnitude of what he left behind. In a sport that typically chews up its heroes and forces them to limp away and decline, Jim Brown refused to give the game that satisfaction. He is the only player in history to walk away holding the rushing title, the MVP trophy, and the world's awe all at once. He froze his image in our minds at the absolute peak of human performance. When we look at the footage of him running over the likes of Huff and Butkus, we aren't seeing a man fighting against time. We are seeing a man who mastered it. He didn't just beat the 11 men across from him. He beat the inevitable decay that comes for every other athlete. He remains the only running back in NFL history to average over 100 yards per game for an entire career, a statistical monument that stands as undeniable proof. There was Jim Brown, and then there was everyone else. For the fans who remember, Jim Brown remains the North Star. He is the reminder that before the money, before the dome stadiums, and before the social media hype, there was a game played in the mud by men of iron. And standing atop that mountain, looking down with a quiet, eternal gaze, is number 32. Stay tuned and subscribe to get to know more about NFL insights.